everyone, and welcome. Thank you for coming so early in the morning, and I also want to say welcome to the people who are watching us on Facebook Live. So the conference is titled Open Borders with a question mark, and just a couple of words before I introduce our keynote speaker who is behind me. So as I said, the entire event is shown on Facebook Live, so you can actually watch it online, and you can also watch the talks on recording afterwards on the same event page. I'm saying this partially for the people who are currently watching online. So there is a quick link for this. It's helpers.hu-obc, which is Open Borders Conference. And you can also check into the event if you want to share it with your friends. The other thing is that the program has changed a little bit, but the time slots are the same. So we're going to start with a keynote talk. Then from 10 o'clock and 11 o'clock, we're going to have two panels. We will break for lunch, and then from 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock, we will have the final panel. So back to the conference title. The conference is called Open Borders with a question mark in reference to Bryan Caplan's work. He published a book a couple of years ago called Open Borders, The Science and Ethics of Immigration, which basically argues for the complete removal of immigration restrictions based on 200 pages of facts and figures in a comic book format. So this book was published in Hungary and also second half of last year under the title Szabad a pálya. And so I think Professor Caplan will introduce us to the contents of this book, after which we will use his talk as a starting point for our discussions. So it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Bryan Caplan, our keynote speaker.
Thank you very much, everyone. Yeah, thank you so much, Barbara. Thanks to everyone who worked so hard to put all this together. And all right. I know everyone is very excited about the situation in Ukraine. I know many of you are working there. And I will honestly say I have not actually worked with refugees personally. I am a scholar, a researcher. I do try to step back and think about the big picture. I can understand if you'll be impatient with some of the things I say because they are so much the big picture, but this is the keynote address. So this is where we step back and do try to get a bigger perspective. All right, so here we are. That's the cover of the book. So just for background, as you know, all first world countries strictly regulate immigration, especially of low-skilled workers. There is a strange myth that we have open borders already. At least in the United States, when I debate this topic, people often say, well, we've had 30 years of open borders in the United States. And I will sometimes respond, yeah, but you know that's crazy. And they'll say, oh yeah, well, fine, it is. Right? But that does not stop them the next time I debate them again. They keep saying the same thing. People in Europe sometimes say you already have open borders. Is that common rhetorically? To say, you know, our open borders policies, our failed open borders policies. Do people say that? All right, well, you're better than us. In the United States, people say this, including my dad, of course. Now, this regulation of immigration is extremely popular. Now, why? Because most people think that unregulated migration would have terrible consequences. I was just at a talk 2 nights ago where several people said it would be suicide. It would be suicide. Do you want suicide? No, I do not want suicide. Right, so why, again, is it so unpopular? Because people think it would be a disaster. Not hard to understand. Now, there is a large body of research that almost nobody knows about because it's written in academic journals and is boring to most people. That actually does try to analyze the consequences of unrestricted immigration. And the main conclusion of this research is that popular views are unrealistically negative, and often extremely unrealistically negative. So let me just go into it. Immigration restrictions are essentially trade barriers. You're familiar with the idea of trade barriers. They're what we call non-tariff trade barriers. A tariff trade barrier is when you say 1,000% tariff, but if you want to pay the tariff, if you're willing to pay the tariff, you can do it. A non-tariff barrier is one where they say you're allowed to sell 1,000 units and you have to get a permit and the permit takes 5 years. That's a non-tariff barrier. Now, these trade barriers that we have for migration create enormous price wedges for the world's biggest market, which is labor. Again, a price wedge is a difference in price between countries. A difference in price for the same good between countries, like the US keeps the price of sugar at 10 times the world price of sugar. Right now, estimates of the size of these price wedges for labor are very large, often over 1,000% after numerous adjustments for labor quality. Because of course you can't just say Haitians have the same skills as people in the United States. There's very large differences in skills. What you want to do is compare a Haitian in Haiti with someone with very similar skills in the United States, and then look at the difference in earnings to understand how big the effect of regulation is. Because of course, in the absence of regulation, you'd expect the prices would be very similar. All right. Which brings us to the slogan that features prominently in my book, $1 trillion bills on the sidewalk. Have you heard about $20 bills on the sidewalk? There's an old economist joke about there's no such thing as $20 bills on the sidewalk, right? So if you're walking and you see a $20 bill, so let's see, $20, what is that? $20 is like, what is it? Let's see, 20, it's like 60,000, what's the Hungarian money again? Say it again. Well, I'll go check my wallet. Hold on. They're called, oh yes, forint. All right. So yes, 60,000 forint on the ground is a lot of money, right? Right. 60,000. Say it would be six. Wait, 6,000? No. Well, so three. You have to multiply it by 300, right? So let's see, 20 times. Okay, yeah, 6,000. Okay. All right. I just got here last night. All right. All right. So you see 6,000 forint on the ground, and you'd be surprised, right? Because if it was really there, someone else would have picked it up already, right? Someone else would have picked it up already. And I will say that I spent about 35 years of my life without ever finding $20 bills on the sidewalk. And then, one fine day, I walked out of my office in the economics department, and I did see $20 bills on the sidewalk, and I looked around for a hidden camera. Are they looking to see whether an economist will ignore $20 or whether he will say, oh, I guess it's my lucky day? All right. Anyway, it really was there. There was no hidden camera. But there still is a logic here, which is, look, if it was that easy to get it, that much, it would have happened already. Right now, when people look at the economic benefits of immigration, they have often called this $1 trillion bills on the sidewalk. You may say, well, look, if $20 bills gets picked up automatically, wouldn't a $1 trillion bill be picked up like that? Right? And the answer is there's an important difference. How many people does it take to pick up a $20 bill? One person, all by himself, can say, wow, I don't know what's wrong with everyone else, but I am picking up the $20 bill. On the other hand, to pick up the $1 trillion bills of immigration, you must convince a country. You must convince an entire country. Has anyone here ever convinced a country of anything? Oh, well, oh, wow. We have to talk because I'd like to convince countries of things. All right, anyway. So Michael Clemens, in his famous 2011 article, he reviews estimates of the global cost of immigration restrictions. Estimates vary because this is actual research. It's not going to give you one precise answer. There's going to be different answers with different assumptions. But a rough estimate is that in a world where anyone could take a job anywhere, this would roughly double gross world product, GWP, a statistic that people almost never talk about, but it's just like GDP, gross domestic product, except it adds GDP for all the countries in the world. And then by comparison, over here on table 1, we see estimates of the economic effects of some other reforms, things like getting rid of all remaining barriers to other kinds of trade. And there you'll see you have estimates ranging from 0.3% of GWP all the way up to 4.1% of GWP. It's important to remember, 1% of GWP is an enormous amount. 1% of GWP is like $700 billion. I would love to own 1% of GWP. I don't. But still, the gains that we get here are still small compared to the total production of mankind. We can see similar estimates for capital flows, and then we get to labor mobility, and this is where we see these massive numbers, because if you double the production of the world, you have done something truly amazing. All right, now, most people that actually analyze immigration policy, in fact, ignore everything that I'm telling you. So in the United States, when you go and talk, not just to policy people, go and talk to academics. Normally, they will just ignore these effects on GWP and instead focus on high-skilled immigration. A lot of focus on high-skilled immigration. But of course, these gains that we're getting that are so large come from not just letting in some computer programmers, these come from letting in all kinds of workers. Now, in the rare cases where people do acknowledge the gains, it's very common to say, all right, fine, you've doubled the GDP of the world, great, but almost all the gains just go to some foreigners, so who cares? Almost all the gains go to foreigners, so who cares? Now, this is very strange in many ways. One is that we have a whole field called development economics. The whole point of development economics is to try to improve the GDP of poor countries. So to say who cares is sort of to say development economics is irrelevant. This is particularly strange because sometimes one person will do both immigration policy and development policy. When they are wearing their hat for immigration policy, it's like, oh, who cares? When they're wearing their, who cares about world poverty? When they're wearing their hat for development policy, then it's like, well, we really care. I'm thinking here of Paul Collier, who has one book called The Bottom Billion about how to end world poverty. And there's another book called Exodus about how to end illegal immigration, or really to end almost all immigration from poor countries. Now, a further reason it is strange to say that the gains all go to immigrants, so who cares, is that we have a lot of historic experience with large increases in production, and they have always been broadly beneficial. Right? Think about industrialization. Building a lot of textile factories, does this only benefit factory owners? Like, no, it benefits everyone who wears clothes. In the 19th century, it would still be very common for one person to only own one set of clothes. Then you have textile factories, clothes become much cheaper, and then people can have 20 shirts. Now, the internet, did the internet mostly just benefit computer programmers? No, remember, most of the internet is free. Therefore, it can't have just benefited computer programmers. It provided tremendous benefits to consumers as well. What about vaccines? Did vaccines just benefit pharmaceutical companies? No, maybe pharmaceutical companies got 1% of the benefit that they generated. Maybe they got $10 billion in profits. The world got trillions of dollars worth of health and economic benefits. All right. These are all examples, but this generalizes. It is very hard, indeed almost impossible, to generate large economic benefits and have all the benefits be enjoyed just by the creators of the benefits. Instead, due to competition, the benefits get spread very widely. The implication is that since immigration restrictions drastically reduce global production, they're almost certainly impoverishing us. So by us, I mean not just the people in this room, the people in Hungary, people in the first world. Now finally, if you think that natives should get even more of the benefits than they do, the prudent policy, it seems, would be to welcome them, but then say, you can come, you can work, but we're going to charge you admission fees. You're going to pay an extra fee if you want to come here. Or a surtax. You can say you can come and you can work, but you have to pay higher taxes than natives, right? Or you could do both, right? And in this way, you can realize the enormous economic benefits while still getting more of the benefits for natives if you think natives should get more. Right, and this is a panel from the book. Let's see, I was asking people in Poland, what is the largest waterfall in Poland? What's the largest waterfall in Hungary? No one in Poland knew, actually. You got mountains, where are your waterfalls? You should be proud of your great waterfalls. Anyway, in the United States, the most famous waterfall is Niagara Falls. It's also in Canada as well. The better view is actually from Canada, so if you're deciding, go to the Canadian side. All right. You're familiar with the expression trickle-down economics? Trickle-down economics. Right. This is a saying to indicate that there's some policies that just benefits the rich, and then a little trickle, a few drops come down onto other people. I say, look, it is not trickle-down economics to deregulate migration. It's Niagara Falls economics. It's a flood of benefit, drowning us in prosperity. Right, now, let me just do a digression to one of the more intellectually interesting criticisms. Do you know this word swamping? Swamping? It's like it is like being overwhelmed, overwhelmed with immigration. George Borjas, who is probably the most intellectually respected critic of immigration in the United States, in his criticism of what I just told you, he says, look, all this assumes that billions of people would move. And that's true, right? In order to get a doubling of GWP, you don't get 5,000 migrants and get that. You need to have billions of people move. In order to realize all the gains, of course, in order to get all the gains. He then infers, look, there's a clear problem with this. Either estimates are way too high because billions don't want to come, which is one possibility. Says, or estimates are way too high because if billions came, it would totally disrupt your society. You could no longer assume the economy would continue to function. But another great critic of immigration in the economics profession, Paul Collier, he actually has a large body of work on what we call diaspora dynamics, the patterns of how immigration develops over time, and he accidentally refuted Borjas. So I'll explain how. So what Collier shows is that the way that migration happens in the real world, unless there is a disaster, if there's a hurricane or a war, then you really will see millions of people trying to move very quickly. But in normal circumstances, when you open a border, what happens is not that a whole country moves overnight. What happens is that a few brave migrants come first, the first ones from their country, right? Because it is very frightening to be the first person from your country to go anywhere. You'll be all alone, though you won't know anyone, they won't speak your language, and so on. All right, so at first, you'll see a few brave people. Once a few brave people show up, then they will email their friends back home or write letters in the old days saying things are good here. Then a few almost as brave souls come. Then the third most brave come, and so on. And then finally, people start bringing their families. Right. What this means is that immigration will normally start slowly and then snowball. So you understand the metaphor of to snowball? Like a little bit of snow falls from the mountain and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and finally it is a Bugs Bunny, a giant ball of snow. You guys have seen Bugs Bunny in Hungary? Yes. Yeah, did the communists show Bugs Bunny? No, in Romania they showed a lot of American cartoons. My wife grew up in Romania. All right, so what this means is that while billions will ultimately come, we have many decades to adjust. And here is a nice example of this pattern. Puerto Rico, so the United States in a false flag war attacked Spain and stole a bunch of land, including the island of Puerto Rico. Then in 1904, the United States Supreme Court created open borders with Puerto Rico, so anyone from Puerto Rico was free to move to the rest of the United States. Then we can see what actually happened. So in that first decade, only about 2,000 Puerto Ricans came to the United States. You might then say, Puerto Ricans don't want to come to the United States. Right? But then the next decade, 11,000 come. All right, well, some want to come to the United States. Then next decade, 42,000. Okay, a lot of Puerto Ricans want to come to the United States. Then there's the Great Depression, it goes down. After World War II, there's an enormous increase in Puerto Rican migration until eventually it reached a fairly stable equilibrium about 20 years ago, and then Puerto Rico had a few more problems, so now there's even more. But anyway, after a century, over half of all people of Puerto Rican descent live in the rest of the United States. So eventually, in the long run, enormous numbers came, but it didn't all happen at once. Instead, it snowballed. All right, so why not? One thing that I've seen from experience is that just giving people enormous numbers of the economic benefits of migration rarely changes people's minds. So why not? Well, of course, there are many people who just do not think in terms of numbers. And then, obviously, numbers don't change their minds. For some people, a trillion, a billion, a million, it's all the same thing. All right, so not people here. Right? But that's one hard thing, is that for many people, they just not think in terms of math, and then it is hard to say that one thing matters more than another. Right? But people who do know the numbers, someone like George Borjas, they very rarely challenge these enormous effects on global production. Instead, what they do is say, all right, fine, you've got trillions of dollars of gains, but we've got some offsetting concerns, some other things that outweigh those. All right, and topping this list of concerns, I know there are many others, and I'm happy to talk about them in Q&A, but there is protecting native taxpayers. Immigrants are going to come and they will be a burden on the welfare state. There's protecting native culture. Immigrants do not share our culture. They're a cultural burden. Protecting native liberty. Immigrants come from oppressive countries and they will oppress us. And the question is, how weighty are these objections? All right, so starting with protecting taxpayers. All right, simple story, which is true for many countries. The welfare state pays more for idleness than many countries pay for work. So during COVID, if you lost your job, the United States government paid you about $40,000 per year. All right, so what is that in fee? No, I'm forgetting. Yes, 40. So let's see. That would be, let's see, 40,000, 400,000, 4 million. All right, so like 12 million. 12 million forint per year. All right, to not work. To not work. Does that sound like a lot of money here? It's pretty good? Yeah, that's pretty good. All right. That's a lot more than many people around the world who work all day, every day get. All right, which then is an obvious reason to come and abuse the system. All right. Now, ideally, if we had more time, we would go over a lot of numbers, and also ideally, I would get all of the Hungarian numbers. I have not done the Hungarian numbers, so I will confess. As you know, I don't even know the name of your currency, so I'm just beginning to be able to think about this. But what I will say is two things that will be true for Hungary as well as other countries. A key fact about all known welfare states: most of the money goes to the old and not the poor, which is important because even poor immigrants tend to be young. All right, the upshot is that researchers very rarely find a big negative fiscal effect of immigration. The one exception for Europe is probably Norway, because they have so much oil money and a small population, which means that every citizen is getting a large amount of oil money. And if you let in more people into Norway, or if they have more babies, this is dividing the value of that oil money over a larger population. For other countries, though, where you actually work to produce wealth instead of just digging it out of the ocean floor, then the fiscal numbers look much more favorable. Right? Again, if this seems hard to believe, another important thing to remember is that a lot of government spending is what economists call non-rival. That means the cost does not depend on population. Immigrants help spread the cost of national defense. Right? If you had a large baby boom in Hungary, right, this would not be a good reason to increase military spending. So we have more babies, we need more soldiers to protect them. Look, you can protect a larger population with the same military, right? Right, and same for things like debt service and so on. Of course, not all government spending is non-rival, but a lot of it is, and this changes the math. Right, now, furthermore, even if the complaint were true that immigrants are currently a burden on the welfare state, why not welcome them freely, but then limit eligibility for benefits? Why not say only citizens get full benefits, or migrants have to go and pay taxes for 10 years to get benefits? There are many ways of doing it that would change the numbers. Right? This is not like Planck's constant, where there is just a fixed automatic effect of migration on the budget. Instead, it depends on what your budgetary laws are. All right, so yes, this one, protecting American culture, though we could also make it protecting Hungarian culture. Yes, you may wonder, is there American culture? Oh, Americans think there's American culture, anyway. So another complaint, we often say that immigrants are destroying American culture. Right now, Barbara was saying that many people think, look, the United States is not a nation state, and Hungary is, and that's the huge difference between countries like the United States and like Hungary. I'll say I think that difference is greatly exaggerated. Americans do believe they're a nation state. If you talk to my dad is 83, he grew up in the 1950s. To him, there's a definite thing that it means to be an American. Right? And if you're not that, he's not happy. It's very important to be American to him. All right. So what are some complaints? They won't learn the language. They won't fit in. Many times I give this talk, and then at the end of the talk, someone says, look, I see what you're saying, but I get very angry when I go to the ATM machine you just call it the ATM machine? What do you call it? ATM machine. And it says press 1 for English, press 2 for Spanish. That makes me so mad. Many people say this. And remember when I was talking about doing math? It's like, well, what's the dollar value of having to push a button 10 times a year? It's like $1 at most. Yet people want to talk about it. All right. A more general way of thinking about this, there's many people on the internet who do not like me, and they say, Bryan is such a fool, he believes in magic dirt. What is magic dirt? Well, it's the theory that when an illiterate Afghan goat herder lands in the United States on a plane, as soon as he touches his foot to American soil, magic happens, and suddenly he speaks perfect English, and he's ready to be an investment banker. All right, and this is a view that has been attributed to me. The dirt of America is magical. All right, so I do not believe in magic dirt. What I'll say is I believe in something that is kind of magical. I'll call it magic culture. What is magic culture? Well, magic culture does two things. First of all, it really does take an illiterate Afghan goat herder and in a short amount of time turns him into a productive member of society, maybe by washing dishes in an Afghan restaurant, which are great restaurants. It's my favorite restaurant in my town. We have a great Afghan restaurant. All right, anyway, so one thing that you can do is in a short amount of time take someone from a very different culture and you can still go and employ him doing a job, probably a low-skilled job while he learns the language, but nevertheless he can take care of himself and contribute. All right, that's a little magical. The real magic, though, is when you look at the children of the illiterate Afghan goat herder and you see that they assimilate to a very high level. The guy who manages the Afghan restaurant, his daughter is getting her PhD. So like he grew up in probably Kabul in Afghanistan, but still, not a highly educated man, but his daughter winds up assimilating to a very high degree. Right now, in the US, if you just look at language acquisition, which is the easiest measure of culture, what we'll see is that over 90% of second-generation Mexicans speak fluent English. There is a common American view that Spanish speakers don't learn English. The real story is that first-generation immigrants, when they come as adults, almost never achieve fluency. They do not do so today. They also did not do so 100 years ago. It is second-generation migrants that acquire fluency. First-generation ones always struggle because it's really hard to learn a new language when you're an adult. Let me talk a little bit about what I call pre-assimilation. One common objection that you get culturally is that, look, in the old days, immigration worked better because in 1900, if you left Sicily to come to the United States, once you arrived, you were never going back. You might write letters home, but those would take months to go and get a reply. Basically, communication and transportation were so poor in the old days, you had no choice but to assimilate. In the modern world, on the other hand, we have excellent transportation, excellent communication, makes it very easily to live physically in one country, but mentally live in the other country and not assimilate. Right? And I say that is true as far as it goes, but it misses a lot of what is happening because while it is true, it is possible to live in one country physically, but psychologically be in another country. But this goes both ways. Right now, there are many people in Sicily who have never been to the United States who still speak very good English, who know a lot about what's going on in the United States, who identify with American culture because of modern transportation and communication. Modern transportation and communication have pre-assimilated people around the world. Many people are part of first world culture even though they've never lived in a first world country because of the changes in modern technology. Right now, there's over 1 billion people on Earth who are not from English-speaking countries who still speak English. Obviously, this is why this conference is possible, right? The reason why you can listen to me is because everyone here is pre-assimilated to the English-speaking world to a very high degree. Right? So you might not have known it, but you are pre-assimilated. Pre-assimilated if you ever watch American television or American movies. Right? If you've ever visited the United States, right? It seems likely everyone in this room, if you moved to the United States, if you had legal work permission, you could get a good job pretty quickly, right? Because you're ready to hit the ground running, as we say. All right, let's see. I think I'll skip over crime, leave that for Q&A. But so even if this complaint were true, then why not just say you can come once you pass a test of fluency, once you pass the test of cultural literacy, so on. All right, and yes, here is another panel from the book, one of my favorites. Yeah, if you take a look here, yes. Over here you'll see this is Uncle Sam baptizing a baby in the waters of America. And look at what happens to the baby when he gets put into the water. Yes, his white baptismal robes turn red, white, and blue. All right. Now, let me turn to an objection that's very popular in the United States among conservatives and libertarians. Right, the very people who normally would be skeptical of government regulation, and including government regulation of employment. Right, and this objection says, look, immigrants come from what we would call status countries. Countries where government has great power, socialist countries. The fear is that they will eagerly vote to ruin our country too. Right, just because you fled Venezuela does not mean that you know what's wrong with Venezuela. You might just say, oh, the problem with Venezuela, it's not socialism, it's just that Maduro's a jerk. Unfortunately, we accidentally got a jerk in power. He destroyed our country, but the idea is great. So I'm going to go to the United States, and I'm going to vote for a guy who's just like Maduro, except not a jerk. Right? That would be what you might say. All right. Now, this is an objection that, again, many people make without actually looking at any of the facts. I actually did some original research for this, which, in general in the book, I wanted to rely as much as possible upon other people's research so that I could say, look, this is not just me saying this. This is a broad research consensus. This was an issue where actually there's just so little research that was done that I had to do it myself. So I'll say is the problem is greatly overstated, at least for the United States, which is the country where I have looked at the numbers. So it is true that non-natives are more socially conservative and economically liberal. By that I mean economically left-wing. So again, this is something where, so the more socially conservative, yes, immigrants are much less woke than native-born Americans, right? But they are more economically socialist. But the difference is marginal. It is not a difference between Stalin and Ludwig von Mises. It is a marginal difference, right? With the exception of least educated, where it is actually larger. But it's also true that non-natives have low turnout. They rarely vote. And this is especially true for the least educated. So the people that you might worry are voting the worst also vote the least. So cancels it out or offsets it. And then a final point. This is one where I'm not sure how you react, but I believe in saying true things even if people will react negatively. In the book, actually, there were several times where my editor said, don't say that, that's going to undermine your argument. And I say, well, I am going to say it because it's true. And I say, what? Yeah, that's how I roll. Right? If there is an uncomfortable truth that stands between me and convincing people, I believe in just honestly putting it forward and then talking about it instead of trying to pretend that it doesn't exist. All right. Anyway, there is a substantial body of research on the question, how does immigration affect natives' views of the welfare state? And a lot of this is done by people in Scandinavia who usually are very supportive of the welfare state, but also pro-immigration. Right? And what they usually find is that there is a conflict, because when immigration rises, it tends to reduce native support for the welfare state, because people do not like supporting outgroups. They don't like supporting outgroups. All right, now, if you are someone who likes both immigration and the welfare state, this is an honest dilemma for you. On the other hand, if you're someone who's worried that immigrants are going to come and turn you into Venezuela, it's a reason to say, oh, phew, actually this is good. This is going to make us less likely to turn into Venezuela, because the people that would have said, yes, have the government give everybody all the money. Oh, wait, if migrants will get some, no, I don't want them to get any. All right. Okay, so it seems that immigrants reduce native support for the welfare state because people resent helping out groups. Now finally, even if this complaint were true, why not just admit immigrants to work and live, but not to vote? Okay, so I will leave it there, and now I will turn it over to questions. I'm happy to talk about current events in Ukraine, although my guess is that many people here know more about it than I do.
Thank you very much, Professor Caplan, and we will now have about 10 minutes for questions, so I'm going to carry this microphone to you.
Thanks a lot. That was wonderfully interesting. My name is Bordijan Nagy, and I teach at the Central European University. And the question is the following. Taxes mainly are not paid by the taxpayers in terms of physical persons. Most of the tax income of a state comes from companies or value-added tax, which is or may be paid by physical persons as well as other entities. So the whole argument against the taxpayers' fears could be alleviated if you explain to them that their taxes contribute minimally. So the budget is not composed of their contribution to the budget. The budget is mainly composed from other sources. Therefore, it's not their money which is wasted on others.
Yeah, that's a great question. Like, we could actually spend the entire day talking about what economists call tax incidence. This is trying to figure out who really pays a tax. If you tax business, does business really pay the tax, or do they just pass it on to consumers? I would say that the general view among economists in all, let's see, I've never read a study about tax incidence in Hungary, I'll just confess. But in all the countries that I know of, the usual view is that the labor supply elasticity is actually quite low, which means that even at whatever the law says, the ultimate burden of taxes usually actually are borne by labor to a very large extent. Similarly, a value-added tax is really actually a disguised income tax, or it's a disguised consumption tax, but again, very similar. So I think the honest thing to say is, whatever the law says, in fact, I know the taxes are being paid by labor. Again, of course, most of it is being paid by higher skilled labor because normally you have progressive taxes. Although I guess, so Europe is different. So you understand the United States does not have a national VAT. We don't have a national sales tax. So in some ways, actually, our tax system is more progressive than yours because we do put such a large share of the tax burden on the upper half of the income distribution. Although even that is a little bit more complicated because we do have something else called payroll taxes that are much more proportional. So anyway, I guess my answer would be rhetorically that might work. Although I think most people do say no, it doesn't matter. Like at least if they don't like the conclusion, they'll say no. Officially it might be businesses, but actually it's everybody that has to pay. And I think actually that's probably about the right answer. Actually. See, other questions? Yes, please.
Thank you, Professor. My name is Victor Mars. I am the Research Director of the Migration Research Institute and the Associate Professor of the University of Public Service. My question is about the people who participate in this competition in the labor market, in the language exam, etc., but they fail to get job, proper work, etc. What will happen with these people if there are open borders, but millions of people move? Some of them manage to get job, integrate, make beautiful careers, but others won't. What will happen with these people?
Yeah, I mean, of course, most people will not have beautiful careers. I mean, most people are average. That's true in all countries. So, I mean, like, if you're talking about people who are very elderly or handicapped, then yeah, like this doesn't really apply to them. In that case, either they're going to be taken care of by family members or their own savings, or it will be taxpayers to take care of them. The good news is that the fraction of people that are not able to work to take care of themselves is actually very small. Right? If you look and you see, well, if it's very small, then how come often we'll see that only 30 or 40% of migrants are working? Say, well, a lot of it has to do with the welfare state. A lot of it has to do with the welfare state, where if you can get a lot of money not to work, then yes, many people will choose not to work. But I say it's not really something in them that they're not capable. I think it is something where the system gives bad incentives. And again, like I said, even if you want to give bad incentives to your own citizens, you don't have to give bad incentives to natives or to migrants. You can have two different systems for who is able to receive benefits or what benefits they get. Now, it's also worth pointing out that another reason why you'll often see low rates of work among migrants is that it is illegal for them to work. So often a migrant will have to wait a year or 2 or 3 years or forever in order to get work permission. They're also afraid to work illegally because they don't want to get deported. I mean, like here's a way that I would think about it. So in the United States, when we estimate the employment rates for illegal immigrants, so these are people who could not legally work, the estimated employment rate for illegal immigrants in the United States is 90%. All right. And this is not because they have a lot of great options. In fact, their options are quite poor, because even if they're higher skilled, it's very hard to get a legal high skilled job. It's much easier to get an illegal low skilled job. And yet still you'll see 90% working. So I say really it is, like if you see lower rates of work, I think it is almost always a reflection of bad policies that either discourage work or say that you're not allowed to work. So again, there's still, like I said, like the honest answer is like you are definitely right for a tiny percentage of the population. Say in a system with decent policies, then that really is all that it is. Of course, there's also kids who will work eventually. I'll have to remember them. Yes.
Good morning. My name is Arif Hussain. What do you say about the strategy of multinational companies moving their industries or factories to a market where they can get the low-cost labor? Is it going to impact on the what do you say $1 million about open borders? Is there any impact on that?
I mean, I guess honestly, I wish that a lot more companies would move to the third world, because that's a much more realistic way of actually solving world poverty. When you look at the developing world, the main problem with the developing world is that they don't have international companies. Like when you look at very poor countries, normally there's almost no international investment. The poorest countries in particular are almost totally isolated from the international economy. The small number of international companies that are there are considered by almost everyone to be the best employers. Furthermore, they are ones that generate the extra benefits of showing modern techniques, of building human capital. So the real tragedy is just that capital normally has very little interest in going to the poorest countries. And why? Well, capital doesn't want to go to the poorest countries for the same reason that people want to leave the poor countries. The countries are broken, right? The governments have terrible policies, extreme levels of corruption. Things are just awful there, right? And that makes business not want to move there. It makes people want to leave. But yeah, I'd say that actually it is great when companies do go to poor countries. And there is some very striking work on the quality of management around the world. So I'm thinking of the work of John Van Reenen, Nicholas Bloom, and some other people. Right, so what they find is that the poorer the country, the lower the quality of management. But by that I mean, nothing controversial, just things like poorly managed companies are ones where you don't keep track of inventory, you don't make sure that people show up on time, you do not have pay performance. What they find is that the richer the country is, the better managed they are by these very simple measures. Poor countries have very poor management of their firms, a lot of nepotism, just very poor record keeping, very little actual effort to even see whether they're making a profit or a loss. But then they find there are two big exceptions. There are two big, there's one big exception I should mention. And the one big exception is that in poor countries, multinational corporations are well managed and have high productivity. So really, a great alternative to open migration would be for there to be massive migration of capital to poor countries to develop them, to go and share better techniques, not just for technology but for management. Again, the problem is that when countries have dysfunctional policies, capital doesn't want to go there. They're worried about getting expropriated, or either directly or indirectly. Yeah, so the general point is when a company moves to a place with low wages, they are making the problem better. They're making the problem better. A company goes there, they hire people. Normally, they pay actually very high wages by local standards, and they improve things. This is right. Like sometimes during a currency crisis, I'll say, hey, maybe I should go to the country that's having a currency crisis, and then a friend will say, what kind of a person would do that? Say, a person who wants to reduce the currency crisis. A person wants to reduce the currency crisis. So, like, if you're a tourist in a country where they're having economic problems, you are making things better, not worse. And the same for a company that goes to a country where conditions are poor, they are making things better. And the way out is, if you just have enough of that, then you get out.
Okay, thank you. That's all the time we have. So thank you so much.
I'll be around all day if you want to talk more.
Yeah, so Professor Caplan will be here, and he's also a participant in one of our panels from 11 o'clock, so you'll have a chance to ask him more questions. So now we're just going to take a very short break before the first panel will start around a few minutes after 10 o'clock. And to the people watching live, I want to apologize that the first few minutes we didn't have the live video working, but the talk will be watchable on the same Facebook event page from recording. So you will be able to watch it in full. So right now we're going to take a break, and we'll be back in a few minutes with the first panel. Thank you.